exchange gas properly. So they start by puncturing that membrane at the top where the air sac is, that little air pocket, and they use their egg tooth and the hatching muscle to get out. They break that membrane, and then they'll use their egg tooth to kind of just scrape the inside of the shell, and that reduces that calcium carbonate layer, and then they can use the hatching muscle and crack through and so forth. And then we talked about the parents usually brood until dry. That's the minimum that they'll usually do. So today we want to start with development of the chicks and how that progresses and differs. So there is a huge range of development in chicks. And this is a huge range from when they are hatched through their development process. Because they're the same way as mammals and other animals in that some species, they're ready to get up and run pretty quick, and others, they're a little more helpless. So I'm going to give you the two extremes and then talk about the middle. Okay? So the first extreme is super precocial. Super precocial. And this is usually just a few birds are super precocial. They're some Australian megapods. And what does megapod mean? Mega means big. Pod means, or pod. Foot. Big-footed birds. It's a particular group of birds in Australia that they call the megapods. But they are super precocial. They are born, they're hatched, fully developed with feathers and ready to fly. Okay. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is most of our passerines that we have here, but passerines all over the world. They are altricial, which is born blind. They're naked and helpless. They have to have the parents keep them warm. They can't thermoregulate. They can't see. They have no feathers. And then there's a great picture. This is what most passerines look like when they're born. They are not cute. Or cute in their own way.
There you go.
All right? So they are totally helpless. You see the eyes are still covered, closed, no feathers. You got little feather buds coming out here, the down buds. But they're pretty helpless. They're not going to survive if something happens to the parents. Now, we did a study on prothonotary warblers. I had a grad student. And last summer, what happened last summer with the weather? Rained a lot, lots of floods. We had every single clutch at the Nature Center was flooded out at this stage or just a little bit later and killed all of them.
Oh.
And so, because they couldn't do anything, the young couldn't. So, anyway, so that's altricial. And the other thing is that there's just everything in between. Okay? So let's talk about the in-between. Now, these categories I don't need you to remember, but they'll help you with some of the examples I'm going to give you. So we had super precocial.
So we don't need to remember these names?
Super precocial.
Or do we?
Not these names. Super precocial and altricial, yes.
Okay.
All right, I can't even remember how to spell it. Pressure's on. Okay, so that's the one that we talked about where they're born with feathers, ready to fly, and live on their own. Okay. There's actually 8 categories how they categorize chicks. So the next one is precocial, just precocial. And there are actually 3 different categories of precocial, all with varying degrees of development. So here's an example of a precocial. These are mobile and sighted with varying parental care. So they're mobile, they can get up and move, and they can see. They have down feathers usually. And the great example are ducks. Okay, the ducks, they can get up and move and walk around, but they just have down when they're born. So they follow the parents, they're protected by the parents. They can feed kind of on their own, but they can't thermoregulate. They just have down, and so they can't thermoregulate very well. Let's put it that way. So they do have some down, but they can't do all the different. If they get wet, they're going to freeze or hypothermia. Okay, because down doesn't dry very quickly, and they don't have that protective. So that's an example of one of the precocial categories. All right. Then we have a semi-precocial. So again, I'm just doing this to show you the variety. The semi-precocial are like gulls and terns. Okay. And they're down covered, and they're fed by the parents. Ducks can feed themselves. Once they get in the water, they can feed themselves. Okay, duck chicks. But the gulls and terns, they're still fed by the parents, and they're brooded by the parents. But they're born with down. And in the case of the gulls and terns, a lot of times they're colony nesters. So if they're threatened by a predator, they actually will kind of leave the nest and run for cover. So they're still mobile enough that they can move and recognize some threats and try to get away. They're not always successful, but they try to get away. Then there's a semi-altricial. So an example of this are kittiwakes, which are also a seabird, and they're actually a predatory bird too. But their chicks don't flee like the gulls and terns, but they're down covered, and they have to be fed and brooded just like these previous. But they can't run away and try to. They just all they can do is crouch down and try to camouflage themselves into the ground. So the difference there is the movement ability between the two. And then the last one was altricial, which we talked about. So this one, and just the general word precocial. Precocial is they can kind of take care of themselves to a certain extent. Okay. And super precocial is they're on their own. So these categories here are how they rate different species of chicks when they're born. And then that's going to determine, obviously, their speed of development and things like that.
And you said those aren't things that we're going to need to have?
Not the different names, no. I just wanted you to be exposed to that. All right. So, we've already mentioned they have a big range of development. There we go. So most chicks of most species can at least thermoregulate in a week. So all those that are born with down immediately, they're going to be able to thermoregulate on their own quicker. But the passerines that are naked and have no feathers at all, not even down, it may be a week before they get that down feathers growing in. And so they have to have the parents brood them. And literally the parents are pretty much there most of the time. At least one parent is. If only one parent is taking care of them, they make quick foraging trips and they come back. They'll grow the down feathers first, and then they'll start to grow their contour feathers. They're usually pin feathers, so they have that sheath on them, so they're real prickly looking at that early stage until they get some of that sheath off the feathers. And their muscles grow enough that they're able to shiver. And it's usually the leg muscles that start to shiver, and the breast muscles. So as it starts developing those big muscles in the body, get to where they can start to shiver to produce heat. So we think in the middle of the summer, okay, why would you need to shiver? But it's the small body size and no feathers. And so shivering keeps them warm, like when the parents may be out foraging or so forth. Okay. So chicks have very, very large appetites. Okay, they're pretty much hungry all the time. And they eat a lot of protein at these early stages. Okay, a lot of protein. Insects, even if they're a seed-eating bird, the adults eat seeds pretty much exclusively. They feed the young protein. So they get it from insects. They get it from shell fragments. So some birds, not all, but some will eat their shell. Parents will eat the shell too. It's a way for the female to recuperate calcium because she puts so much calcium into production of the shell. So she eats it, but the chicks will eat it too. And as I mentioned, the diet may differ from the parents. So the parents may not eat what they feed the chicks very much. And then I mentioned this yesterday that some pigeons and penguins, but not all of them, they feed their young crop milk, those very early stages after hatching. It has lots of fats and proteins, and it comes from their crop, which is sloughed esophageal cells. So we know that those linings of our digestive tract slough off pretty continually. And so they do too, but they use that to feed their young to provide that protein again. Okay, it doesn't sound appetizing, but. So chicks will solicit food by begging. And this is screaming. They're very noisy when they're hungry. They will gape. Their mouth will be open to give a target. Okay. They'll move their head so that they can attract attention to the target, the mouth. And so they're real awkwardy looking a lot of times when they're young. Some mouths are colored, brightly colored inside or contrasting. Some are black inside. It creates that nice big target for the parents to look at. Now when they're first born, they'll beg at anything. If a shadow, the tree, the wind is blowing and the shadow of leaves go over the nest, they'll beg. Okay, because they're hungry, they're growing going to grow very rapidly. But it can really hurt them if it's a predator. And they start screaming and gaping and sticking their head up and so forth. But they will learn fairly quickly to recognize their parents so that they don't make that noise and don't attract attention to potential predators. We have this Phoebe that nests on the porch of the field station every summer. And you can always tell when they just hatch because you walk up on the porch and those chicks, their heads pop up, they're gaping, they're screaming. And as they get a little older, we walk up on the porch and they just go poof, and just go down and hide. So again, they learn, you can tell kind of how far along they are, about potential predators and hiding and things like that. So again, I just pulled up Google Images to look at this gaping behavior because it's really dramatic. You can see, I hope you can see these, but they are really trying to stick their head way up. They're trying to be the tallest, the loudest, the first mouth to be fed, and probably, in many cases, the tallest one is going to be fed a little more often. Now the mom will feed all of them usually, okay? But you can see here, she, the male or female, will just stick the food really right down their throat. And you can see some that are a little more brightly colored that provide that target. Here's some better examples of targets. They have silly pictures in here too, but the bright yellow, a lot of them are yellow when they come in. Even as they get a little older, they will continue to be fed. I don't know what that one is, but the female there is, and you can see the bright yellow mouths here and so forth. So just get on and look at some pictures. They're really, really fun to look at. And they go through that pretty ugly stage. Okay. All right, questions about chick development or anything?
Does that color go away in the?
A lot of times, sometimes it does, and then sometimes some species just have colored mouths. Woodpeckers tend to have dark mouths, really and black inside almost. So, all right, let's talk about nests a little bit. I know you've done this a little bit in lab, so. So you know that the shape varies. So that's what is the shape and where are they? Okay. And you know that the shape varies depending on the species of birds. They can be like the killdeer, which is not much more than just a little flat spot or depression in the ground, and they'll lay their eggs right on the rocks. They do no building at all. Ledges, like a lot of the raptors and so forth, it's just a flat ledge, and then they'll put a few sticks around. I have a study going on barn owls, and they put barn owl boxes up for them because they're cavity nesters, and they just go in and lay their eggs right on the bottom of the box. There's no padding put in or anything like that. It's just, so a lot of birds don't make big nests or use big nests. They can be cavities or burrows. Tree cavities are very popular for a lot of different species of birds. And when we continually cut dead trees because they ruin the forest, we're destroying habitat for bird nesting, because all your woodpeckers, chickadees, titmice, even starlings and house sparrows, house wrens, all these different species, and then your owls too, nest in cavities. So when we're constantly cutting dead trees, now I have no problem with it, around buildings or something. You don't want the tree crashing on your building. But if we're just cutting them because we don't like a dead tree, we're destroying a lot of habitat. And so they need those dead, decaying, dying trees to be able to nest. Some are stuck to something, like the swallows is a great example of that, and they are stuck to the side of a bridge or the side of a barn or whatever, and they will use mud, they'll use their own feces, and they'll use saliva in different mixtures depending on the species to stick the nest up there and build it. And they're made of wooden nests, made of mud pretty much exclusively. Some will float. Some of the aquatic birds actually have floating nests, so that a lot of times they'll build them within grassy, marshy areas so that the nests aren't floating around the lake or anything. But they're floating, they're not sitting on anything hard. And then some, of course, the most common ones are these in the treetops. So you get really unique nests from birds that build these incredibly woven structures with the hole in the side. Okay, too many of the cup nests, which you talked about. This looks like probably a vireo or a goldfinch nest. Some of these big weaver nests, like these. And when you get to like Africa and some of the South Americans, you get these really elaborate colonial nests. There's all these little holes in there, lots of different birds there. There's a couple species in South America, Oropendulas, And not to be crude, but they look like testicles hanging in the trees. Okay, they're these little bags hanging down. And then, that's an unusual one. I think that's Photoshop, so, yeah. Here's some of the mud nests, and this is all mud and saliva and maybe a little feces mixed in. And then I want to show you these really giant weaver birds in Africa. Okay. And the little bitty hummingbirds' nests are about this big. And then the bowers, we saw the video about the big bower birds. And there's one other one I wanted to show you. These weaver birds are incredible, what they do. And this shows you the size with a ladder next to it. All right, where was that one? Some of the raptors, the bigger birds, will do these really elaborate big ones. A couple of you have talked to me about Carolina wrens. They'll nest pretty much anywhere they can find a spot to put a nest. In a bucket, on the wreath on your door, a whole variety of things. They'll nest pretty much anywhere. All right, I'm not going to find those ones I was looking at last night. There's some of those big colonial. Oh well, I don't know how far down I went to look at nests last night. But this is how some of the swallows look. They're just jam-packed in there. All right, I'm not going to see it. And then we have our edible ones right here. Okay. So the function of a nest. What is the function of a nest?
To raise your babies.
You want a safe place to raise the babies. What else? Protection. You know, depending on the species, they're more for protection than others. Some of them are, like some of the small passerines, are camouflaged enough that they're hard to spot if the tree's all leafed out and everything. So that is protection. Cavity nesters, obviously that's protection, and so forth. So protection is very important. And then some of them are domed, or they're, you know, those round, big woven structures, so it really is a protection from weather. A lot of our passerines, they nest in the trees, and when the trees are leafed out, that provides a lot of protection from the weather. You know, you stand under trees when it's raining because it slows the rain down and it diverts a lot of it by the water hitting the leaves and so forth. So there is protection from the weather. Some are better than others with that. And you do have a lot of the big species, the raptors, are out just on these exposed ledges, and so the parent just hunkers down and rides out the bad weather. And I showed you the picture of the snow on the one, the eagle. So hygiene is very important on the nest. Why would hygiene be important?
Parasites.
You want to keep as many parasites out as possible, and so you're going to try to keep it clean. What else? Potential disease spread. You get bacteria growing on feces that's in the nest or something like that.
You're right out of room too. If you give too much waste.
Yeah, you can get just a lot of waste. Just think if all the owls coughed up their owl pellets and left them in the nest, they would pile up pretty quick. Anything else? It's also an anti-predator thing because your feces is going to smell. Okay? Even for a bird, it might not smell a lot, but to a predator who has better smell than we do, it may be very noticeable. So it's also a way to not attract predators, to keep it away. So adults will usually defecate over the side. It's a good way to spot nests a lot of times if you see a lot of the fecal material in a place. It's a great way to see where owls perch during the daytime because you'll have the white streaks coming down the side of a tree or something like that. It's probably a night roost for them or something like that. Fecal pellets. A lot of birds, the young will produce fecal pellets. And this is what this little white thing is right here. Okay, so the baby birds release a pellet of feces instead of the more liquidy, the uric acid. Okay, so with that pellet then, the parents can take it away very easily and keep it clean. Once the chicks usually get old enough where they can defecate over the side, then they stop the pellet idea. But here's the part, these fecal pellets are very nutritious, and so the parents may eat them, okay, to get some of that nutrition back, but a lot of times they just take them away from the nest. And they could just pick it up and drop it outside the nest, but what they do a lot of times is they fly away from the nest and drop it. Again, it's an anti-predator kind of thing. Even the adult birds, they will defecate over the side, but they also will fly away and do it. You want to avoid that. Usually if they're just doing it over the side, it's because they're still brooding or whatever. So those fecal pellets. And that's one thing we counted. We watched these prothonotary nests, and we counted the number of times and who brought out, was it the male or the female that brought out the fecal pellets. And they both, in the prothonotaries, both genders did it, but the females did it more. In many cases, a lot of birds will add some kind of fragrant vegetation. And so, and it could be like just a little sprig of pine. It could be a cedar sprig or two. It could be different mosses. Anything that's a little more fragrant, because again, you're trying to avoid detection by predators, by smell, and potentially they think that some of this vegetation is actually a parasite deterrent. So chemically, parasites are repelled by some of the smell or something like that. So there's potential, just that general smell, but also to deter the parasites. We've already talked about incubation. But warmth is the biggest one. The eggs need warmth and the young need warmth. Most eggs require about 38 degrees Celsius, which is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So they need to be kept pretty warm. And it needs to be a fairly constant temperature. You can't have big fluctuations. Now obviously if the female's out hunting for food and gets no help from the male, there's going to be some cooling time, but that's where that albumin comes in and the nest comes in to kind of reduce that cooling while the female is out eating or whatever. Some females don't eat near as much as often when they're brooding as they would otherwise. So you have to keep it at constant temperature. There can be environmental incubation, which is where just the environment that you're in keeps them warm enough. So obviously, species in the desert, you've got pretty good temperature there. And in fact, you may have to cool the eggs in those situations. But at desert in the night, you've definitely got to be brooded because nights cool down. But the most classic example was in that handout I gave you. They called them the thermometer birds. And these are those Australian megapods again that bury their eggs in rotting vegetation, very similar to an alligator that they do. And they can keep them warm by that digesting, decomposing material. And so they use that instead of the parents sitting on the eggs to incubate. And that particular species uses their bill and they stick it down in there to judge the warmth. That's why they call them the thermometer birds. But the majority of species use direct incubation. So they're actually sitting right on the eggs to keep them warm. So that's by far the most common. The time period of incubation can vary greatly. You've got African weaver birds, the ones that build those huge nests. They incubate for as little as 9 days. You've got, now to the other end, the penguins, some penguin species will go 2 months or more. Especially those, you've seen the king penguins in the Antarctic, have you guys seen those videos? And that the male stays and incubates the egg over the whole winter, so that's a couple months time. Kiwis, there's again that big kiwi bird, it incubates for 85 days. It's a bigger bird when it hatches, so they incubate longer. Most of the ones around here are in the 2-week range that they incubate the eggs. A lot of the passerines anyway. So there are some physiological changes that happen in the parents to help them incubate, okay? Or to make them more likely to incubate the eggs and then also take care of the young. And it's hormonal. So in the female, prolactin is going to increase, okay? The hormone prolactin. And this helps trigger that desire or need to incubate and parent, okay, and take care of the young. So they've gone through the other hormones, the progesterone and estrogen that helps them produce the eggs and ovulate, just like we do, and then the prolactin increases and triggers that incubation. And it also causes development of the brood patch. The brood patch. We've talked about this a little bit on the female, and I'll show you a picture in just a second. Testosterone will decrease in the males. Okay. And so remember, in the springtime, breeding time, testosterone increases, and that triggers the increase in the size of the testes and production of sperm and so forth. It also, that increase in testosterone triggers territoriality. Because a lot of birds will lose their territoriality in the winter. Okay? Part of it is just the need for survival. You don't want to spend your energy competing for space or whatever. So when their testosterone increases, they're ready to start singing and to start defending the territory. Well, once they have the mate, the nest in the area, the testosterone decreases, so they're less likely, the males are less likely to get in territory battles. Now, they're still going to sing and things like that, but not as much. Okay? They're going to be spending their time doing other things. And it's as testosterone decreases, that desire or need to courtship will decrease also. So they're a little less likely to go out and try to find additional mates during this time period. So in our prothonotary warbler study, we actually counted the number of times males sang every hour. And we compared before eggs were laid, while the female was sitting on the nest, after the young were hatched, and then after fledging. Okay? And so they sang the most at the beginning, before the nest. Obviously, they're setting up territories, things like that. They sang quite a bit when the female was sitting on the nest. Okay, so they were looking still potential for another mate while the female's sitting on the nest. But their lowest point of singing was when the chicks had hatched, because then they were sharing responsibilities of feeding the young, and so they didn't sing as much. And then once the young fledged, their singing popped up again, and they tried to do a second. A lot of the passerines will do 2 clutches if there's time. So their singing will vary, and their territory will vary depending on its testosterone levels. And that depends where in the whole development cycle it's going on. All right. The brood patch. The breast and belly feathers, and these are the down feathers. The down feathers are pulled or are just lost. And that is triggered by that prolactin. And then you can see it here. We blow on the belly to see if it's a female or male, especially if they're the same coloration, and if they have a brood patch. So you blow on the belly, and whoever was doing this, it may have been me, it may have been somebody else, didn't get the feathers out of the way here, but you'll have a nice big patch all the way around here that's just bare skin. And you can see it here, the bare skin, but it goes all the way up. And that skin is going to swell and with fluid. So the vessels kind of enlarge, and there's a lot of fluid put to that area for temperature. The blood vessels dilate, as I mentioned, and we talked about how we rate the cloacal protuberance in males. We will rate the brood patch of females to it's bare, but it's not all swollen. And then when it gets swollen, it's much larger, and you can see individual blood vessels because they've dilated, and that's very active. That's a key point. They're sitting on the nest at that time. And then it goes beyond that, and once it starts to go down, it gets this real wrinkly look because it was all swollen up, and now it's so we can tell where the females are in the cycle. Are they actually sitting on nests, getting ready to, or have they just finished? By looking at the brood patch. There are a few species that both males and females develop. How appropriate. So, like titmice, the males will also develop a brood patch as well. Okay. So it's really, we can't tell the gender necessarily of titmice because the males have a brood patch, so they share those responsibilities. Yes?
If something happens to the female, will any of the males take over on the nest?
Depends on the species. And again, this is down feathers. So all these contour feathers cover that up, and you would never see it if they're flying around or anything like that. You're not going to see a big bird with a big old bare belly, okay? So the contour feathers cover it, and it's just the down feathers that are lost, and that allows the female to put those right on the eggs. Put the skin right on the eggs for warmth. They can change how they're sitting on the eggs to change the temperature a little bit, so they can kind of judge the temperature. They'll raise or lower their body to regulate it. If it's really incredibly hot, they may go wet their skin, go to a water source, wet their skin and those contour feathers, and come back and put that wet on the eggs to get evaporative cooling. Like we sweat, they'll put the water on the eggs to cool it down. And then once the young are hatched, those down feathers grow back on the female. All right. So, remember that your test is Tuesday. We will do all those mating systems, including those examples in that handout I gave you. So all the breeding samples, and then we'll do all the reproduction. Okay? It'll be it won't be a horribly long test. Now, I still remember that we need to do some of that physiology stuff. That'll be on the final. And I'll go over it again before the final.
On the handout you gave us, you said you were going to go over how much of that we needed to know.
Well, you're not going to know names of birds or anything like that, but you're going to be able to recognize patterns, like is this a monogamous or a socially monogamous or that kind of thing. So remember that handout was all examples of different types of monogamy.
Do you have an extra handout? No, you didn't get one.
Thank you.
I do have a couple extras, just a couple.